Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the slight delay in the start. We've got multiple programs going on at the same time. Welcome, everyone. I'm Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here this afternoon for an intimate but important conversation with Ambassador Philippe Étienne, bienvenue, the Ambassador of the French Republic, and Ambassador Jonatan Vseviov. Thank you for being with us. Ambassador of Estonia, of course. It's interesting that these two ambassadors are here together to talk about the transatlantic partnership in 2020. These two ambassadors are forces of nature. They are two of the most consequential voices on issues on the transatlantic agenda, both by what they do here in Washington, but also, of course, what you've done in your capitals as well. And it's pretty striking to bring together France, Estonia for this conversation. But as we were just talking, these two countries have done some remarkable things together as part of demonstrating carrying the burden within the transatlantic community. French and Estonian forces serve side by side, not just in NATO operations, but they serve side by side in Mali. And I mention that because we've just lost 13 French soldiers in Mali as part of a real testament of what it means for us to have allies that put things on the line, sacrifice, and are out there taking care of issues where we don't have to as Americans or American forces. And as an American, we're grateful. We're grateful for our allies. We're grateful for France and Estonia and what your forces are doing in the Sahel, on Europe's east, together. So here at the Atlantic Council, we obviously, in our community, recognize the absolute necessity of a strong, united community. Many of us are just returning from London, from where we had on the eve of the NATO leaders meeting a large town hall debate, NATO Engages, with about 1,000 people organized by our Scowcroft Center here that's been part of this, along with many of our partners across Europe. And we brought together leaders, incredible voices, the most popular celebrity, pop star from Afghanistan, to Justin Trudeau and Stoltenberg and everyone in between, to examine the triumphs and the challenges facing the longest-standing, most successful alliance in our history. And we saw firsthand in London and felt that it sort of exemplified the dynamics that we see in place in the transatlantic relationship that we'll talk about today. Sure, words matter, rhetoric matters for member states and for our leaders, and that can be concerning. We heard a lot of that. But I also want to say that we saw beneath the surface that our alliance looks better. It is better than it sometimes looks. Our commitments at the heart of the alliance are being tested, but they're standing strong. This is a family, and in family you have differences. And if you think about the differences that we've faced as a transatlantic community since our founding, they're pretty significant. How did Truman and Roosevelt disagree with Churchill over handling Stalin? How did de Gaulle manage 5 different American presidents? The Suez Crisis, the debate over rearmed West Germany joining the alliance, Vietnam, the dual track strategy of the 1980s, Bosnia, lift and strike, Iraq. These have been pretty serious. Today, we've got quite a few debates out there. President Macron has provoked a debate in many respects the way President Trump tried to provoke a debate. But we also have more American forces in Europe since 1989, and NATO hasn't completely adapted a whole new set of strategies to bolster our defense in the East. We've seen European allies step forward with $130 billion in additional new spending, an agreement in London on common funding. We also saw coming out of London some of the strongest language we've seen since the end of the Cold War on viewing Russia's activities towards our community as a threat. The first formal recognition within an alliance statement of China is something that is really an issue on the agenda for allies. So as we have celebrated throughout this year NATO's 70th anniversary, the relationship between the United States and Europe relies on NATO, but we also understand, and we'll touch on this, how important that is with the European Union, a strong European Union, to have a healthy transatlantic partnership. This work has been led here by Ben Haddad in our Future Europe initiative, which is premised on the understanding that resilience and strength of the European Union alongside the unity of NATO is a critical national interest of the United States, especially as we face the types of challenges we're dealing with in the next decade. a rapidly rising China, revanchist Russia, increasingly hostile Iran, wider divisions between different members of the transatlantic community, trade at the front of that, environmental issues. The new commission of President von der Leyen has hit the ground running, and its priorities, such as regulatory reform for tech companies or the European Green New Deal, certainly will provoke reactions and views. But as we look forward next year to the 70th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration, the current state of U.S.-EU relationship, I think, offers an opportunity to think anew. And as the EU begins its own self-reflection process again, how do we think about the U.S.-EU relationship to reshape that relationship to be better prepared to tackle some of the challenges we're talking about? This will form a focus of our work in 2020. More, stay tuned there. So in that vein, we are thrilled to welcome both of you ambassadors here to share the European perspective on the current state of the transatlantic relationship and the outlook for what promises to be an incredibly consequential 2020, with major debates opened across the Atlantic within Europe, and of course a fundamental debate here in the United States about the future of our country as we head into an election season. So as part of Europe, as part of Nato, and as close allies of the United States, both France and Estonia have been key partners in figuring out the challenges. I'm going to hand over and invite Elise Labode, who will actually introduce and get this discussion underway. Elise is a global affairs journalist now with the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She, of course, covers U.S. foreign policy and international affairs, most recently as the global affairs correspondent for CNN. And since 2000, she covered U.S. foreign policy and international affairs for the network, reporting from more than 80 countries and traveling with more than 7 secretaries of state. She also appears as a foreign affairs analyst on MSNBC and is a great friend of the Atlantic Council. Elise, let me welcome you up along with the ambassadors to begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Damon. And thank you to everybody for coming. Hopefully you can see me. Oh, okay. I was hoping they were going to do that. Thanks very much. Well, it's, Damon really kicked us off, setting the scene for the moment that we find ourselves in. So I think we'll just jump in. And ambassadors, thanks very much for joining us. Let's start with Ambassador Étienne. Obviously, President Macron's comments in London before the NATO summit in an interview with The Economist talking about, the NATO being brain dead because of the lack of U.S. leadership, the lack of consultation with France on the withdrawal of special forces from Syria also on his mind. I think that's really set a tone for the summit, which I think reverberates, days after people are still thinking about the concept of NATO. That was a very colorful analogy, but NATO certainly, and as we know, is not the organization that it was 70 years ago. So why don't you put into context, if you could, for us, the president's remarks, a little bit more about what is on his mind and how you think that affected the discussions in London.
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation, and I would like to thank Jonatan and my Estonian colleague for giving me the idea of a common, this common participation. I would like also to thank you for mentioning the 13 French soldiers who've died, who were killed combating terrorists 2 weeks ago, because it's something very, very important for our subject also. Indeed, this interview by President Macron to the Economist was a sort of wake-up call to remind us that the strategic environment has changed very much since the NATO was created, to say the least, and also to say that what happened in eastern Syria requires a serious debate among allies. But he said also that his criticism is not on the military side. He said that the military side works well, interoperability works well. He mentioned this more as a lack of, as you said, consultations and exchanges on the strategic vision. And from this point of view, we are happy that this debate, maybe because he spoke this way before the summit, the summit was not only a summit of celebration, the 70th anniversary of commemoration, but also a real debate between the
reflection,
leaders.
reflection.
And also that we got what we had asked for in the, I think it's point 7 of the final statement. We got a commitment to launch this forward-looking reflection, collective reflections on the alliance, not the alliance of yesterday, but the alliance of tomorrow. This is what basically we wanted, so it's good. And we were happy to have this open discussion, both in the meeting itself, but also we had contacts with the UK, France, Germany, and Turkey, for instance. Our president wanted to speak openly, and we got this possibility, and it was very important. Finally, of course, in this interview, he gave what is for us one very important part of the answer, which is that the Europeans commit more for their own defense, re-engage in our defense policy. We are doing that nationally. France has increased by 3.5 billion euros his national defense budget in 2 years, but nearly 3.5. But we want also more collective action by the Europeans. It's what we called the Europeans' defense policy, but it is consistent with NATO. Our president spoke about the European pillar of NATO. From this point of view, also, it's very positive that we can, together with my Estonian colleague, appear here with you and talk to you.
I want to talk about that joint cooperation in a moment, but how did you find, obviously it's very rare that a leader will kind of speak truth to power in their way before one of these summits. They're usually, as you said, a kind of very celebratory occasion. Did you feel that offered the chance for candid discussion, or did he find himself on the defensive? Because, there was a lot of talking, in the media and such, commentary that his remarks, were insulting in some way.
Well, I don't think that the reaction by the other leaders was not to take the opportunity to discuss. There was this discussion, as I said, and there was a decision to initiate this collective forward-looking reflection. So I don't think he was on the defensive, not at all.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Vseviov, as Damon and Ambassador Étienne said, in Mali in particular, Estonia and France are working together, and that shows that, everyone talks about the financial cost of burden sharing, but as Ambassador Étienne said just before we came in, the biggest cost is also of blood. And so you are sharing that kind of that burden together. We had the unfortunate and tragic death of these soldiers. President Macron also made some comments about Russia not being the enemy of the alliance. How did your country perceive those remarks, and the good cooperation between Estonia and France, notwithstanding, not just in Mali, but in so many other ways? How did your country perceive some of the tone that was set for the summit?
Well, thank you. First of all, is it on? Can you hear me? I have to turn it on. Okay. Can you hear me now? Good.
I just scream and...
Yeah, that's what I usually do, but I see the cameras here, so... Thank you for the question. Thank you, Philippe, for doing this, and to the Atlantic Council, obviously, and to all of you for coming out. The only problem, well, there are several problems. I'll mention all of them before I get to the substance of the question. First, whenever I come here, and when Damon is here, when he does the introductory, the problem is that he usually says everything that I intended to say more elegantly in a concise manner. So you will be bored with everything that I have to say, because I will say nothing beyond what Damon already said. Thank you, and thank you to Atlantic Council in general for everything that you do. Secondly, if my voice is trembling, it's because of the awe I find myself in always when sitting on a panel with a representative of the Welsh School, the best school of foreign service in the world, of which I am a graduate, I need to mention. And finally, I need to apologize. I mean, I went on Twitter before coming here as ambassador. I'm not big on social media, but obviously in the United States, in Washington, D.C., you have to be on Twitter. So I went on Twitter. I'm becoming more accustomed to it. And before coming here, I actually made sure to see what's on Twitter about this event. And I must disappoint a lot of our, hopefully not the audience here, but a lot of people were anticipating a huge fight between me and Philippe on matters of importance when it comes to European security. There's not going to be one. There's not going to be a fight. Huge disappointment, very, very boring. We actually see things more similarly than people assume. And that's why we thought this would be a great opportunity to not only tell the story of how we see European security, security in general, but also tell the story of what we are actually doing. Now, obviously, the media concentrates a lot on the on harshly worded statements that our leaders sometimes make, and I think this is this now is the new era. I think we should get used to this. And even though I want to take nothing away from the importance of words, and I do believe that words matter, we also need to concentrate on the substance. And I'll say a few things on the substance. First, this summit of last week was a huge success story. A huge success story. I mean, not only in the media, but in the expert circles before the summit, there were all sorts of awful scenarios that people played with. What could happen, what might happen, and none of them materialized. None of them. There is more consensus, or this consensus is stronger on the threat than ever before in certainly our membership in the organization. You look at the short declaration that our leaders agreed to, the wording on the threats that we face, pretty straightforward, no hiding anywhere. This is the consensus view by all heads of state and government. Now, we are, of course, a diverse alliance, geographically diverse, culturally diverse. Geography still matters, even though the world has globalized. So the way we look at the challenges is different. The way we perhaps even prioritize challenges is different. But what unites us is the fact that we as societies are based on the same set of ideals that now in this contemporary 21st century world have come under attack from numerous sources. And an understanding not only by our leaders but by our societies that we can only deal with those challenges when acting together. I think this is the guiding principle. This is the outcome of the London leaders meeting. Now, when it comes to NATO operating on the ground, then I think we're on the right path. And France is a great example of that. I think what we are doing in not only in out-of-area operations, but also what we're doing on the border of NATO is a good example. And France was one of the first nations that came on board with the whole concept of enhanced forward presence. France is every single day French soldiers in Estonia, where it actually snowed a few weeks ago, serving alongside British, Danish, Estonian soldiers as part of NATO's deterrent force on the eastern periphery. We, at the same time, while also spending the majority of our effort in our region, have deployed forces to Africa. Now, you may suspect bigger European nations of all sorts of motives. You can't suspect Estonia. Estonia is as far from Africa as you can be when it comes to Europe. There is no history that Estonia has in Africa. I mean, frankly speaking, I'm not sure if we're being, I can see we're being recorded, but don't quote me. We're not in Africa because of any other reasons but our alliance relationship with, in this particular case of Mali, with France. I mean, this is why we're there. I remember the story vividly. The terrorist attacks, our leaders approached their French colleagues asking what could be done, and the French responded that, well, help us with the burden. Help us with the burden globally. In a matter of weeks, we came back, said, okay, we can't come with battalions or brigades. We're not there. There aren't that many of us, but we can show up with a platoon. And as always, as was the case in Afghanistan, as was the case in Iraq, when we show up with no caveats, ready to go. And that's what we did first in Central African Republic, now in Mali, because of this solidarity that we feel between Estonia and France. Now, finally, so when we look at the words that our leaders used, this is a long answer to a pretty straightforward question. When we look at it, we don't just look at it through a perspective of a newspaper reader or a television watcher. We look at it from a perspective of a country that actually knows France and witnesses everything that we are doing together, both behind the table at the North Atlantic Council, but also on the ground in Mali and Estonia. So there is actually more unity, more good stories than what the press reports.
Well, I mean, the relationship obviously is a good one, and you, France's presence in Estonia and your cooperation in Mali. I think, though, that the president did, do you agree, showed that NATO needs to face some hard truths, and is forcing a discussion about the need for Europe to take more responsibility and also to debate the Russia question.
Well, if there was a debate, then debate is natural. I mean, this is why NATO is not just a military alliance; it is also a political organization. That's why we have the North Atlantic Council in session always to discuss threats and security policies. We've been making that case for years. I mean, we need a NATO that is agile, that is up to the tasks. There are a number of things that need improving. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think that history ended when the French soldiers arrived in Estonia. I don't think that history ended when we joined the alliance or when we conducted the last great, summit. There's more to be done. There's more to be done. A lot of what has to be done is mundane military stuff that never interests panels like this. But a lot that has to be done is also, philosophical and strategic. We think that there is no debate in Europe when it comes to the importance of the United States as a player in European security. At least we are of that opinion. We don't think there is a lot of much debate around the importance of strengthening the European pillar. That is why we in the European Union initiated what is known as PESCO, and we did so during the Estonian presidency of the EU Council. I mean, you can't find a more transatlantic nation in Europe than we, partly because this is a life and death matter for us. I mean, this is not just a political construct. American leadership, American role in Europe is a matter of critical importance. And yet we are certain that PESCO and the development of EU defense is going to be helpful not only to NATO, to Europe, but to us directly as well.
Ambassador, everyone says that there's, this is obviously the two things are not incompatible. U.S. leadership is important in NATO, and the Europeans, as you say, need to take more responsibility for collective defense as a pillar within NATO. But, the allies, in particular in Eastern Europe, are starting to have doubts about the American security guarantee, the future of U.S. relationship in NATO. So can you talk to the audience a little bit about how France sees leadership in NATO? I mean, it's always been that the U.S. was the unofficial kind of leader of NATO. Yet President Trump, he has a good chance of getting reelected, wants to do less in the U.S. Clearly, President Macron has taken initiative to do more. Can NATO do what it does, maybe not with the U.S. out of NATO, but with less U.S. leadership? Will other nations, France, other nations, are they equipped to kind of pick up the slack and there still be a transatlantic alliance, but not one that, there's always been this perception if the U.S. doesn't lead, no one will. I don't know that that's the case anymore.
Well, first let me say it is a personal, something personal, but I was in Estonia with President Macron. He visited Estonia, and I was with him. I was his national security advisor, and I remember, and the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May, was there too, and your leaders, your president and your prime minister. It was really something important to be there. Politically, it means something. France is really committed militarily to NATO. We committed for 10% of the new NATO readiness initiative, for instance. And we are really very, very, I think nobody doubts the capacity of our army in combating missions. So we are very, very proud of being together with Estonia in Mali in the fight against terrorism, which is the real enemy we face. And thank you, Jonatan, for having reminded us of the terrible terrorist attacks which were plotted from northeastern Syria, from Raqqa, against France on November 13th, 2015, Bataclan and other terrorist attacks on that evening. Now, of course, the answer, which is also what the US expects itself, is to your question, is more engagement by Europe. And here, I think we are quite in agreement between Europeans and Americans. And indeed, we have nationally committed more money to our defense. I gave the figures for France, and we are also coming to. We are getting to doing much more together. When Jonatan mentioned the PESCO is something very concrete. You know, it's over 30 concrete cooperations with different types, different groups of participants. It's all about very concrete ways to bridge the gaps when we have shortages in some capacities. The Europeans are starting to do their homework and to increase their engagement, not only in increasing their national defense budgets, but also in cooperating more together. This is the real, I think, answer, and I think it is also, it corresponds to the expectation by the US.
Okay, but President Trump has said, he seems to be saying anyway, a lot of these European threats, whether it's Russia, whether it's some of these other threats that are to NATO's borders, and Africa, I guess, could be, considered that, not our problem. The U.S. benefits least from NATO, and that it's time for the U.S. to detach itself. So my question to you is, without the anchor of the U.S., are you worried that NATO won't be the same? But I'd like both of you to answer. Why don't you start?
Well, again, my answer is that the U.S. will remain all the more committed to NATO.
Are you sure about that?
If it sees that the Europeans take seriously their own defense. It's absolutely normal, and I'm sure it is the right way to go.
Ambassador.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd just like to quote a sentence from. Everybody should actually read it. It's online. It's 2 pages long. The declaration. One sentence. Russia's aggressive actions constitute a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Terrorism in all its forms and manifestations remains a persistent threat to us all. This is from the declaration issued last week. Now, this audience knows this, obviously, but just for the sake of it, sometimes these declarations, they use funny language. They're not as elegant as Shakespeare is, and the reason for that is that the way they're prepared is not, Secretary General Stoltenberg does not just sit down and draft it. This is a consensus between all the allies, reached after negotiating not for a few hours. It usually takes weeks. This is from last week. Now I think we're on the periphery of the Euro-Atlantic area. We feel the threats directly every single day.
From Russia.
From Russia, including. They're not made up. It's not as if we reach some kind of a misunderstanding and are all confused. The world is becoming more dangerous, and the challenges that NATO leaders are talking about are probably going to get worse before they start getting better. It's the instability in the wider Middle East, the geopolitical changes, and so on and so forth. I think it would be a grave mistake to assume that the democratic world can handle these growing challenges alone. NATO is not perfect. No organization is. But we, at least in Estonia, see no alternative to strengthening NATO, strengthening the transatlantic relationship when dealing with these challenges. So, I mean, obviously we're concerned. We're constantly concerned. This is what we get paid for. I mean, we're governments, foreign ministries, defense ministries. We deal with scenarios that hopefully will always be unlikely. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why they remain unlikely is because we work on them. But there is no alternative to unity. And the European aspect, the European development in defense, in our opinion, is in no way in contradiction to what we're trying to achieve in NATO.
Which is also our opinion, which our president said.
So there's total agreement. Why don't you
Well, I told you it's going to be boring.
Our president told of a European pillar
right.
in the context of NATO.
Why don't you, if you could characterize how France, how you see the threat by Russia today? I mean, I want to get into some of the less traditional threats that are facing NATO and how you combat them. In Estonia, in particular, with cyber, has been very good in that regard. But how should we see the Russian threat, and how do you think that's something that the Europeans will be forced to tackle more directly, given the U.S. Maybe disagree? At least at the president's level, there's less of a agreement that Russia poses a threat.
Well, you know, our president answered this question also in London. He had to handle with Russia even before his election. And after his election, we had very difficult discussions also in the field of the use of chemical weapons, for instance. So there is absolutely nothing naive in our attitude. On the other hand, what he said is that in view of the future stability and security in Europe, we have to talk with Russia, and it is what he is doing right now, by the way, because there is a Normandy format summit with Presidents Putin and Zelensky, Chancellor Merkel and President Macron in Paris on Ukraine. So it is what he said exactly, and it is something we know is not easy, but we will do it.
Several years ago, I think before Ukraine, maybe late 2009 or maybe it started, but there used to be decent coordination and cooperation between NATO and Russia through the NATO Council, NATO-Russia Council. There used to be good cooperation. Obviously, there were always concerns of Russia with the expansion, with missile defense, but there was a mechanism for discussing those disagreements and kind of dealing with the insecurities, and there was a process for cooperation and debate. Do you think the fact now that there is no discussion is hurting it, and do you think maybe it's time to start some kind of resumption of that process, Ambassador?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't overemphasize the utility and usefulness of the formats that we had. If they had been as useful as sometimes we make them sound, then we would not need a Normandy format today, which is obviously discussing the war that is taking place in Ukraine, where thousands of Ukrainians have died on Ukrainian soil, not in some out-of-area operation, defending Ukraine. We are 100% on board with the point that Philippe made on dialogue. You need to have a dialogue. No question about that. At the same time, I want to emphasize the other aspect where NATO is in consensus, and for that matter, European Union as well, which is that we need to have the dialogue from a position of clarity and strength. And when it comes to NATO and military affairs, that means a credible deterrence posture that we not only think is necessary for the security of NATO, but also believe to be one of the preconditions for stability itself. Now, NATO in the 1990s and 2000s, I don't think this is a big surprise, to a large extent went out of business of deterrence and defense. We're now back in business. I think this is not just the result of the London leaders meeting, not just the previous Brussels summit, but a few summits now have put the organization back on track. Are we there yet? No. There's more to do. There's more to do. And this, by the way, is dialogue as well. What we do is also what we communicate. So I think we're on the right path. It's too early to tell how the Normandy meeting went. At least I haven't had time to see what the outcome is.
It was probably not over because it started with this afternoon, at the end of the afternoon in Paris. So,
Ambassador Étienne, how do you balance sending a clear message through deterrence and other actions, and having a discussion about common interests with Russia?
Well, we want to have both, and I agree that we have to make clear our positions and our security interests. It's what we have been doing for the last years, including France, inside the EU, and not only NATO, after what happened in Ukraine. But it doesn't prevent us from having this dialogue, also on issues where anyway we will need participation of Russia. For instance, in the Middle East or in Iran, Russia has signed the JCPOA, for instance, and will be part anyway for in many discussions on arms control, on non-proliferation. That's a fact. So we have to talk about this, including on the subjects concerning the future of the security in Europe.
Let's talk a little bit about Turkey. Obviously, whether it was during ISIS or even before, Turkey's membership, its concerns about human rights abuses and violations at home. Obviously, its recent actions in Syria, the incursion into Syria has caused a lot of concern and debate about Turkey's membership in NATO. What is the future of I mean, I don't know how Syria. There have been discussions over the years about whether Turkey should still be a member. I don't know if those discussions have really reached, critical mass. But what is the future of Turkey in NATO? How do you deal with so many concerns about their actions when they're really not a productive member of the alliance right now?
Is it a question to me or
I'm looking right at you.
So, well, I am sure it is for either of us to answer this question, because you ask us about something which should be asked.
So all members.
No, I mean every country has to define its own position. But what I can tell you is that I said it before. We had this meeting on the margins of the NATO summit in London between Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Johnson, President Erdogan, and President Macron, where we have made clear our positions concerning the action in northeastern Syria, and indeed we have. We had our strong feelings, and we have our strong feelings about the security interests of France and of Europe, of many countries in Europe, as far as the fight against ISIS, Daesh is concerned. And we have said what we thought about the consequences of this military action of Turkey on this fight against ISIS. And it was absolutely important here again to have this open and conversation with the president of Turkey in London. And I think it was
Did he get the message?
It was clearly said that we agree that the fight against ISIS is a clear priority for all of us. But it's clear also we did not agree on everything. But at least we had this discussion, which is very important.
What does it say, Ambassador, about the strength of the alliance when two nations, the United States and Turkey, kind of negotiated this incursion into Syria outside of the confines of how NATO should be handling the conflict?
Well, I think we've seen throughout not just the past few years, but throughout NATO's history that the outcome is better if we conduct our policy or the operation jointly. There have been several cases. Damon mentioned some of them in his introductory remarks where that has not been the case, and as a matter of just something for graduate students to look at, the outcomes in those cases have not been very successful. So it's always best to act together. Turkey is a NATO ally. That's a matter of fact.
Are they an ally?
Oh,
Are
they
they?
are.
They're
Oh, they
a
are.
member of NATO. Are they acting like an ally right now, though?
And this is, I think, especially for us, this is very important. This is a treaty-based organization, not a punditry or a graduate school discussion-based organization. You are an ally if you're a member of the Washington Treaty. It is very, very important for us to be clear when using those terms, who the ally is, who the partner is, especially from our perspective. I mean, we're on the periphery. We don't want to create any confusion as to where Article 5 begins or where it is enforced and where it isn't. Now, there are many issues. Philippe mentioned them. I think the only way we can solve the issues, and I'm not taking anything away from the problems that we are having. These are serious political problems. The only way we deal with them is having a discussion, either bilaterally, multilaterally, or at the NATO table. And I think that discussion is taking place, and from that perspective also, London was very useful. You can always say that, look, those leaders' meetings or summits are only photo opportunities, that everything has been negotiated beforehand and these things don't matter. I think London is a good example of the opposite. They do matter, because leader-level engagement sometimes can be helpful. Haven't solved anything yet, but I think we're on the right path.
Ambassador Étienne, are there some kind of consequences, though, for Turkey if it continues to act outside the, confines of consulting with NATO and taking unilateral actions like that? I mean, you say that a message was delivered. You
No.
didn't agree, but where do you draw the line?
I couldn't give a better answer than the answer given by Jonatan.
See, and you expected us to fight.
Okay. I have one more question, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience. Let's talk about some of the, modern-day threats. Obviously, we said that, when you look at issues such as cyber, Estonia has been very active. In addition to being a transatlantic alliance that was founded on, keeping Europe whole and free, how do you see NATO evolving, and how has it evolved to tackle some of these, contemporary, non-traditional threats?
I think it's a very important and relevant question, because you must realize, and it's part of the evolution of the strategic situation around NATO I mentioned, you must realize that the world has changed, but also that the threats are different. And there are two good examples for this, which I think were handled by NATO, which are cyber and space. And the question of security in space was also discussed in London, as far as I am informed. And there is, we have this Supreme Command from Transformation of NATO, which is in Norfolk, with a French general leading it, and it's a part of NATO which is very important, which looks at the future, at the new threats, the new challenges NATO has to take, and I think it is a very important part of the reflection we must have.
Ambassador,
new threats.
Ambassador, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, we mentioned cyber, but there are other threats that I think, fall in this kind of gray zone between kind of military and political that, certainly NATO will have to, if it continues to evolve, will have to tackle.
Yeah, it's part of the same story that the world is becoming more complex. The challenge is more, certainly not in any way easier than they were in the past. Now, we've been making the case for years that cyber is a domain. We realized it back in 2007 when we became a target of a major cyber attack that targeted not the narrow sectors of government or military or intelligence agencies, targeted the society in general. So we've been arguing that, look, if we are committed to defending our societies, and we are developing capabilities for that in the air domain, in the naval domain, and so on and so forth, then we have to start considering cyber as one of those domains. Now, it took a while for everybody to reach a consensus on this, and now there is, I think, consensus on this, and NATO is moving along. So I think overall the trajectory we're on is positive. It's the right one. We are a small ally, again, on the periphery, sometimes very impatient with the pace of movement. Would like to see more and faster, but I think all in all we're headed in the right direction. The first step always is to recognize that there is a danger, that there's a threat out there. And I think when it comes to cyber, it goes without saying now. I remember days that weren't that long ago, in 2007, we had to actually convince people that this is a thing. And I remember going to the Hill, to think tanks here in D.C.
Yeah, Estonia was one of the
nobody wanted
leaders
to talk about this, because it sounded as if some science fiction story, and now this is mainstream. So I think we've come a long way. It does take time, especially in multilateral organizations.
It took, I really think 9/11 to see, for NATO to see terrorism as a thing, as a threat that NATO had to work together. Where is China on that spectrum? In terms of being a threat, obviously, it's reaching out politically and its influence on the economic sphere, but is China a military threat or a security threat that NATO has to work together to combat?
Well, about China, there are military and other types of challenges. There is a rise of Chinese power. Undoubtedly, there are technological challenges, such as in the telecommunications domain. And China is also a very important country with which we have to engage, as we do it for instance, in climate or in environmental matters.
Do you see, Ambassador, China as a growing area that NATO has to work closer together? And I know it's
I just want to quote one more quote, and that's it. And so we recognize that China's growing influence in international policies present both opportunities and challenges that we need to address together as an alliance. This is the first time that NATO official document mentions China from last week, and certainly in that context. So I think this is where the consensus is. I think we can't discuss China in the context of transatlantic relations without mentioning trade. I mean, clearly, the contemporary world in general, but especially issues related to the rise of China, are not narrowly defined in military or security terms only.
No, but NATO is a security alliance.
NATO is, but the transatlantic relationship is not only about NATO, which is crucially important, of course. It is also about the EU-US relationship, as well as our collective bilateral relations with the United States and Canada, for that matter. I think the same that I said earlier on NATO applies here. We are stronger together. We can't handle this challenge alone. I don't want to get into the details of the discussion. The problems better than I do, probably. But it is not wise, tactically or operationally or strategically, to argue amongst ourselves, while what we need to do is unite and address the challenge together. I mean, together as the EU and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's open it up to the floor. If you have a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you. Do we have
Screaming.
Screaming works too.
Only at NATO. I'm Harlan Owen with the Atlantic Council. Thank you, and I'd like to thank the moderator for asking some tough questions, but I really like to be much blunter in getting responses. I'd like to pose to you the same question I posed to Secretary General Stoltenberg and to Deputy Secretary General Joanna in London last week. NATO spends 15 times more in defense than does Russia collectively, 10 or 12 times more if you consider purchasing power, which some people do. Having said that, that spending may increase national capacity. It does very, very little for an overall NATO capacity. And there are three areas that I'd like to get some specificity where NATO seems to be doing very, very little. Despite the concern in what we have done in your part of the world, Jonathan, The Black Sea remains a black hole, especially with Turkey, Georgia, and Ukraine. And while we've given lip service to reinforcing that part of the world, we've done very, very little. Second, with the abrogation of the INF Treaty, Russia has a huge HUGE advantage in theater nuclear weapons, about which we've not discussed, even though New START may in fact be extended. And thirdly, and most importantly, it seems to me that the real challenge is not military from Russia, but political, economic, and especially in terms of active measures. The Russians have interfered in Brexit. They're interfering right now with the riots in France. They've interfered every place. And quite frankly, they're doing a masterful job. And so what is NATO doing in those three areas about the Black Sea, INF, theater weapons, arms control, and most importantly, active measures?
Thank you. We'll have them answer them.
Michael Trekim, I'm with
Wait,
the...
no. I said we'll have them answer, and then you'll just be next. Okay?
Harlan, as always, good questions. Very, very complex issues. Would love to, spend a day on them, but I'll be brief. I think when President Macron was talking about the importance of having a political discussion at the NAC table, I trust this was what was on his mind. I mean, these are issues that matter. They're not necessarily traditional in the military sense, but we need to work together to solve them. And NATO has not been traditionally the organization for this. We've either handled these issues domestically with our own domestic institutions, sometimes with the European Union. The understanding now, I think, is clear that these new developments in those new domains, they affect our security, and we need to work together to address them. It started a few years ago with cyber, but I can go on. You had a list with which I agree. On military expenditures, now there's been a lot of attention on that, and just for the sake of it, we have been at 2% of GDP for quite some time. Now, I'm also a former defense official, and I'll let you in on a huge secret. It is unfortunately the case that dollars or euros do not translate directly into capabilities. I think we're seeing this all around the world. If they did, we would not have wars, because people would not miscalculate and they would not attack the stronger power. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So I wouldn't translate the might of NATO when it comes to defense spending directly to the might of NATO when it comes to actual deterrence and defense in all of the regions. The Black Sea you mentioned, I can throw in the Arctic, I can throw in the Baltic Sea region, or even the Mediterranean for that matter. So indeed, again, there's a lot more that we need to do. Also on the military front, to enhance our posture to a level that would make, for instance, us comfortable.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer in details to your three questions, because contrary to Jonatan, I'm less a specialist of defense policies, but I am sure that Black Sea is also very much discussed in NATO. On your second point, which is indeed very relevant, it's one of the issues we have to cope with in the European defense policy projects. We spend, each nation in Europe spends more and more, but the issue is not only, and I understood your question going in the same direction, to spend more, but also to spend more efficiently. And if we cooperate more, and it is exactly what we try to aim with the structured cooperation in defense in Europe, we have to cooperate more so that our spendings complement each other, do not duplicate, and create more efficiency through more common programs. It is what the European Union is doing right now, which will give for €1 more, more than €1 more in efficiency. It is our aim, and it's a real issue. We recognize it. I wouldn't say that we have riots now. We have a strike against the reform of pensions in France. So we must not confuse things with the other things. So just to a comment.
But the question of political and economic and active measures, I mean, it's a very interesting one, because traditionally, NATO is a security alliance, but now we see that these are national security threats and need to be dealt with in that context.
Yes.
The nature of the threats is evolving. It's obvious. When you mention cyber or space, it's clear.
Okay.
Thank you. Michael Chek-Kim with the Asia Institute. So in terms of unconventional threats, NATO, right, is a security alliance, and I'm thinking in terms of terrorism and the recent attacks, Pensacola, for example. France had a stabbing incident, and of course London as well. What happened at London Bridge just some weeks ago. Is something like that, with lone wolf attacks, domestic terrorism, is that considered part of like NATO's counterterrorism efforts? And especially for countries like Estonia, I wonder what would be the view of taking on that in terms of the NATO security agenda when perhaps Estonia does not share the same level of threat from like domestic terrorism. Thank you.
Well, domestic, yes, I do agree with you. However, we do subscribe 100% to the so-called 360-degree approach to security. And that's why we have troops in Afghanistan and Iraq and Mali. And actually, since we regained our independence in 1991, the only areas where we have had casualties, people dying, have been from places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Not a single NATO soldier, or for that matter, Estonian soldier, has died on the eastern border of Estonia. We've had a few kidnapped, but thankfully returned. So, I mean, we recognize that geography varies, that the priority list of concerns is different for different allies depending on where they're situated. I think the beauty of NATO and the European Union and this community of democracies is that we don't need to limit ourselves to just following the treaty, for that matter. I mean, we are in Mali because of terrorism. We are in Mali because France was attacked, and we demonstrate our solidarity. It is not a NATO operation. For that matter, Barkhane is not even an EU operation. Yet we're there because France is a member of the European Union and a member of NATO, and we are a member of NATO and the European Union as well. So it's not as there's more flexibility in our responses than first meets the eye, I would say.
Let me give us also an answer, because you mentioned the lone wolves acting as terrorists, and here, and both in Europe, in the United States, in many other contexts, unfortunately, there is something at stake which is very important here, which is the fight against radicalization, and especially on the internet. Of course, it is not necessarily the task of NATO, but it is still a priority, and it's quite a good example or a bad example of those new challenges to the security of our societies and our citizens. And it shows one dimension, which is new, which is we must act against these threats not only through cooperation among governments, which is crucial, more important than ever, cooperation, but also through cooperation with other stakeholders, and in this case, with the internet platforms and with other stakeholders in the society, which is something very important to face the new challenges, the new threats.
I think we have time for one or two more. Why don't we go over here? I'll tell you what we'll do. If you have a question, raise your hand. Okay, we're just going to take a very quick round. We're going to take a very quick lightning round. Just ask your question, keep it short. We're going to keep the answer short, and we're going to close up.
How can we fix the Turkey problem? How can we bring it back to NATO?
Good question.
What are the implications for the new European Commission and the new EU president on, NATO's capacities?
You don't get a question. Okay, right here, super quick.
One thing that hasn't really come up is the potential impact of Brexit on the transatlantic security implications. Also within the European context, whether or not you think under the next EU budget, the European Defence Fund will be fully funded by member states.
Okay.
And I would have a question about EU-NATO cooperation. And of course, we have come such a long way in the last years to make this happen. What are the main and most pressing priorities from your perspective, but that need to be urgently, where the discussion needs to be intensified, and we need to be doing much more than what we are doing already?
Okay. Let's. We have Turkey, the European Commission, and Brexit, and European defense.
I didn't get the European Commission question, and neither did. Can you repeat the question?
What implications might the new European Commission have on increasing NATO capabilities as well as the transatlantic relationship?
Okay, that might be in a whole nother session, but okay. Let's. Why don't you, in that vein, maybe tackle some of it, and we'll close up from there, and we'll ask the ambassador to make some.
Okay. So I don't know. The Turkey question, my answer is I don't know. The European Commission, I'm very hopeful, and I'm not speaking as an ambassador of Estonia here. I'm speaking as a citizen of Europe. I think European future is linked to the success of the transatlantic relationship, amongst other things, of course. And the messages that the new team that has come to Brussels has sent are very encouraging indeed. And as our EU colleague has promised, there will be an onslaught of visitors from Brussels to the United States. And we've already seen that there are some positive rhetorical movements from the other side as well. So I'm hopeful. And this is certainly the first thing that needs to happen to start putting the relationship on a stronger path. EU-NATO, I think this is crucial. I mean, the thing that people hate most is when bureaucracies become an obstacle to progress. I mean, most EU member states are NATO allies and vice versa. So we can't afford to have two armies. We can't afford to have two structures. We need to make sure that there is cooperation. We've made a lot of progress here as well. And now as we progress, as EU defense is developing, I mean, there will be mistakes. I mean, we will certainly make mistakes, and we will have to have enough flexibility in the EU part of Brussels to be self-critical and then fix those mistakes if we make them. I've forgotten. I'm sure there are other questions.
On the Brexit question, well, on the top of the fact that the UK obviously will remain a very important member of NATO, we said in France that we want to keep a very strong bilateral defense relationship between the UK and France, but also a very strong defense relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom. It will be part of the negotiations.
And it'll still be a member of NATO.
Yes, I said it at the beginning. But on the top of that, we will have to discuss the future relationship between the UK and the United Kingdom and the European Union, and we then would have to. It's our view, our French view. Our president has made proposals. Actually, we would have to build a new strong relationship also between the UK and the EU.
Okay, I'm going to try one more time on Turkey, and I think our friend asked a very concise question. How do we bring Turkey back into the fold? How do we repair the rift between Turkey and the rest of its NATO allies?
We have answered as much as we could answer. Well tried, but
I mean, how do you?
It doesn't depend on us, and we work with Turkey. Again, we have also many common views on some other issues.
Let me try it this way, though. It does seem, since Turkey was not admitted into the EU, that it's been slowly drifting away from leaning towards a Western approach to its foreign affairs. Is there more cooperation within the EU and Turkey that can be done that could help Turkey's military and foreign policy strategic objectives?
But we have plenty of cooperations between the EU and Turkey. In all fields, we have an association agreement. We have a customs union. We have obviously a very sensitive in a very sensitive domain, which is migration. We have also agreements. We have that, and we have to work with Turkey anyway. We have no choice. We are neighbors.
Okay, we tried. Ambassadors, thank you so much for a very lively discussion, and thank you to all of you and to the Atlantic Council.
I was not your student, but thank you very much for moderating this.